Well, good morning. Good morning. Here we are in the second segment of the Back to Basics series for 2019. And in Back to Basics, what we do is we go back to the introduction to the Science of Mind text by Ernest Holmes, and we review those chapters. And we review them every year because in a year's time we have grown. In a year's time, we see and hear and understand things differently than we did a year ago. So it's always good to go back and kind of re-examine the fundamentals of what this teaching is. And I've been doing this since the late 80s, I guess. And I can tell you that every time I go back and read the chapter, it says something different to me. It speaks differently to me. I think I read it 3 times this morning. And it gave me 3 different meanings, 3 different messages. That's how rich it is. That's how deep it is. Our consciousness moves. Our consciousness changes. It grows. Hopefully it grows. And we can go back and look at the same thing over and over and over and get a different meaning and a different interpretation. That's why we come back every year and ask ourselves, what do we mean by this? What are we talking about? In our studies, in our reading, I mean, we read and we listen and we do those things because it kind of stimulates our thought. And it leads us to explore more deeply that which is already within us, that which is already there. And that's why we do it. It's kind of like getting the ball rolling, getting that snowball rolling down the hill. It's not so much the words that we hear on a Sunday as it is the way that we process them, the way that they mull over within our consciousness for the rest of the day, for the rest of the week, and then some. So we come back to this introduction to the Science of Mind text, and as I was saying last week, we were talking a little bit about Ernest Holmes and how he kind of came to these ideas. And in the very beginning of this chapter, he says that this teaching is not a special revelation to any one person, but it is rather the culmination of all revelations. And I think that's very significant. We want to look at that. Most of the religions and the philosophies that are in existence today, and even if you go back in time, they start with the experience of one individual. One individual has a certain experience, a mystical experience, an experience of cosmic consciousness, an experience of enlightenment. There are many different names that they go by. And then out of that, a new movement is born. And the adherents then study all about, read all about, hear all about the experience that person has had. And sometimes what happens is in the course of history, as time moves on, the idea that the individuals who are studying, who are reading, who are listening, that they too are just as capable and just as eligible, if that word is the right word to use. They are just as capable of having that experience as anyone. That seems to get lost, and what tends to happen is that teachings get caught up in ritual and in dogma and in sustaining and continuing the teaching rather than focusing on the experience. So what Dr. Holmes is telling us from the get-go in this chapter is this is not about him saying this is a special revelation that he had, that he was visited by some divine presence and got this revelation. But rather he's saying, if you go back and if you look at the different religions and the different philosophies of the world, if you just look at them as a scientist might look, you start to see these threads, these themes that run through. And this is what he's saying. He's saying, let's look at this. Now, just by way of history again, I always like to give a little bit of the background and the history of how things come about or how we think things come about. In 1898, William James, who is referred to as the father of American psychology, William James was in Edinburgh, Scotland, and apparently Edinburgh must have been a hotbed of metaphysical studies in those days, and they had at the university. They had these conferences, these meetings where speakers would come from all over the world, and they would talk about religion. They would talk about metaphysical things. They would kind of expand ideas. And William James was invited there, and he spoke. And his series of lectures was called "The Varieties of Religious Experience." Now you can still buy the book. It's very, very thick. It must be like 1,000 pages long. And it's not an easy read, but it is an important read, because what William James started to do is he started to do exactly what Ernest Holmes is talking about here. Remember now, Holmes started writing in 1919, so he started writing some 21 years later. But in his talks, William James was kind of saying, suppose we step back. He said, no one has ever looked at religions, this topic of religion, no one has ever looked at them in a scientific fashion. And he says, what would happen if we made a science of religion? What if we started to examine the not only the ideas that religions teach, but the experience, the varieties of religious experiences? What would we find if we were to look at them in that manner? And I believe that had an influence on Dr. Holmes. I can't prove it. I can't say that he ever said that himself. Other people have supposed that had an impact on him as well. But it was, 21 years later when he started writing down the ideas that would become known as religious science. What would happen if we would step back without fear, without superstition, and just examine, just open ourselves up to examine and say, how beautiful the human mind is, how beautiful our thought processes are. How is it, the work, for example, that Joseph Campbell did, where he was able to go across cultural barriers and across time and across space, and he could look at the mythologies of a different people and say, yes, look at that. Look at what they're pointing to. Isn't it the same thing that these people over here are pointing to? Different time, different space, different location. These ideas, these important ideas rise up in human consciousness. Sort of Carl Jung's collective consciousness. Right? In Man and His Symbols, Carl Jung says, we have, doesn't matter where we grew up, we have certain basic symbols that seem to arise in human consciousness, and they hold similar meanings. And it doesn't matter what language people speak, it doesn't matter what year they lived. But there's something there. You see, there's something there that is trying to bubble up, through human consciousness. Campbell tells us that this thing that we call God, and remember, this is a term. He says, but the term God is a metaphor. It means it is. It is. It stands for. It's not like, it is. Right? A simile is something that is like or as. The metaphor is. God is a metaphor for that which transcends every limitation of human consciousness. That which transcends every limitation of human consciousness. That is what this thing called God is. Limitations of human consciousness. We recognize things have a beginning and a middle and an end, our lives included. God always was, always will be, and just is, you see. In our experience, we recognize that there are limits to our powers, our physical strength, our intellectual strength, a limit to what we can know. But this thing that we call God, it transcends that, see? It is all-knowing. It is all-powerful. So this idea of this isness, as the Buddhists might call it, the isness or the suchness or the I amness of the Old Testament. Right? Remember Moses had an experience. Moses had an experience of the burning bush, of the fire that burns but does not consume. And this was a metaphor for meditation. Deep mystical experience that occurs in meditation. Right? Same thing with riding to heaven in a chariot of fire. The one thing about the mystical experience is that it is ineffable. It is ineffable. We don't have words to adequately describe it. We can experience it, but then we can't tell anyone what we experienced. And even if we could, my experience is going to be different than your experience and someone else's experience. But there's something there. There is this experience there. There is this presence that we can experience. The presence of the divine. The presence of God. And this idea permeates wherever you'll find a religion. That's a fundamental tenet, is that there is this thing. There is this thing called God. And last week we talked about the thing itself, and Holmes, I believe, used that term, the thing itself, to make us think. See, to make us think. So often in our conversation and even in our stream of consciousness, in the however ideas flow through our screen of consciousness, you know, for some people it's words and they hear words. Other people it's pictures. Other people it's music. Some people it's feelings. Combination of all of the above. However it comes to us, we have this idea, you know, that there's this stream of consciousness, and either we're generating it or we're observing it, or both. And words come up, and we use words, and we rarely stop to think about, well, what precisely do I mean by that word? What exactly do I mean by that word? So it's interesting if you watch the discourse or lack thereof in today's society, how often people get into an argument with one another, you know, start calling each other names on social media. No, you know, that's a crazy idea, and they never even stop to say, but what did you mean by that? Excuse me. What did you really mean by that? What is your intention? So this word, God, we use that word and it means something different to everybody. If I use that word and I'm speaking to 1,000 people, there might be 1,100 ideas of what I just meant, because some people would have more than one opinion. So Holmes uses the term the thing itself to cause us to stop and say, but wait a minute. What do you mean by that? What does he mean by that? So we have the thing, we have the presence, we have the divine, we have God, we have the Father, we have the isness or the suchness or the I amness. First cause or principle or life or nature, doesn't matter to it, what we call it, but it matters to us, because our idea of what it is and our relationship in it and with it, see, that sets the tone for our whole lives. So I believe what Holmes was trying to do was he was trying to go out and say, listen, if we looked across this broad path of human thinking that kind of falls into religion and it falls into philosophy, if we did it as a scientist might, and look and say, well, what things seem to be common and what things seem to be different, then we might find some common generative themes. We might find some common ideas. And one of those common ideas is there is something. There is this thing. There is this presence. And it is a creator. It creates. this idea that, that this existence that you and I are experiencing here and now, we didn't create it. You and I did not create it. But this idea that there is a creator, or a creative force, if you want to call it that, or a creative power, that something caused this to occur, something caused all of this to happen. This, again, is a theme that runs through different teachings. We're very familiar in our culture with, the creation story in the book of Genesis. And that creation story, if you step back from it, there is this thing that pre-existed or existed before creation, as we know it. And it caused creation to occur through an act of will, volition, intention, decision, however you want to think of that. It said, let there be, let there be. Now something acted upon that word. Somehow that word, now this thing called God doesn't have vocal cords like we do. So this act of will was a mental movement, a movement of thought. Let there be, let there be. But somehow something acted upon that word, took that word as its direction. And now mind you, this is us trying to break things down into understandable segments. And we are taking that which is ineffable and trying to describe it. And we are taking that which is a unified whole and we're trying to describe it in pieces just because it makes it easier for us to understand it. And we have to recognize that it is none of those things. It is beyond and before and way more than any of those things. But yet we are where we are, and we have to do the best we can with the tool we have, which right now it is primarily the activity of thought, our intellect. And we use that until we get to the point where it no longer works. We walk the razor's edge. The intellect, the intellect can tell us that there is that which the intellect can't know. So the intellect can never know the unknowable, but we can experience it. We can experience it. Sounds like double talk. Sounds like double talk. But that's, to me, that's what the razor's edge means, right? So we could say there's a land over there, and we can know it, but we're not going to get to it with the intellect that we have. The Upanishads say that which is before words, but from which words come. That which is before thoughts, but from which thoughts come. In Buddhism, we get the concept of the unconditioned mind, the unconditioned mind. So there is the thing, whatever the thing is, there is the thing and there's the way it is, and we can experience that. And then the intellect, the monkey mind, starts going to work, labeling it, identifying it, analyzing it, judging it, and all of those things. And all of those things are not it. All of those things are our opinion of it. This is a very important concept to stay with. Where do you experience anything? Where do you experience everything? Now you might say, well, for example, we stopped last night at an Indian restaurant and we had some food and it was a bit spicy. And you might say, well, I experienced the taste of the food on my tongue. That's where I experienced taste. Really? Really? So, if I could take a tongue and temporarily remove it from a body and put food on the tongue, would the tongue still taste? Would the individual still experience the taste? And the answer is no, because the tongue might be an instrument through which we experience taste, but we don't experience the taste in our tongue. Where do we experience the taste? So if you're technically minded, you might say, well, there's certain nerves that are attached to the tongue and they come kind of up and they come into our brain and it's in the brain. It's in the brain. Really? Are you sure? How do you know? How do you know it's in the brain? Where do all the senses come together? See, where do all the senses come together? One of the techniques that we use in meditation is to try to sit quietly and to find that place, that center, where all of the senses come together. Where is that center? Where is it? And I think the bottom line is we say, I don't know. I can't tell you for sure. I don't know. And you can get even deeper than that, and you can say, who is this I who does not know? Who is the one observing, the one trying to figure out where this occurs? So everything that we experience is an idea, is a thought. It is an interpretation somewhere in this thing that we call consciousness, that we recognize as my consciousness, as me, as I am. And it is in that place in consciousness that we call myself, the I am, that we have these ideas of what God is and how God works. And we know in our own experience, we know in our own experience of consciousness, right, the intellect can't get there. The intellect can't go there to wherever it is that we're having this experience, because it occurs before the intellect. It occurs at maybe a deeper level is an easier way to explain it. So if there's a level of mind that is down here, then the intellect might be up here, and these things might bubble up into the intellect, or they might bubble down from the intellect, but the intellect can't go there directly. It doesn't know it directly. It only knows of it. I think to myself, I'd like to have an idea about maybe a talk that I'm going to give, or a story that I'm going to write. And then later on, these ideas kind of bubble up into my screen of consciousness. And I think to myself, well, gee, I had an idea. But where did I have the idea? See, the I that had the idea is not the conscious I. The I that had the idea is the observer. So the only point I'm trying to make there is we talk about knowing things, and we have to really ask ourselves, how do I know? Where does the knowing take place? There is a knowing that takes place. There is a knowing that is before the intellect. This is the experience. This is the mystical experience. The experience of unconditioned mind. The isness, the suchness, the I amness. So if we think of this creative process then, If we look across different religions, if we look across different philosophies, and we say it's okay to ask, it's okay to consider, it's okay to think, because that thinking, that very desire, that intention to know goes somewhere, goes somewhere in consciousness, somewhere that the intellect doesn't know about, somewhere that the intellect hasn't been able to go. And then the answers start to come back to me. What is this thing called God? What is this thing called life? What am I in relation to it? And these are the questions that Holmes is dealing with here in the beginning. So you can see, how deep these 4 chapters are. And in the rest of the text, the entire rest of the text, is an explanation by way of. It's more and more and more ideas to help us get back to this fundamental, to these fundamental ideas. Another influence on Holmes, as it directly relates to these 4 chapters of the introduction, was Thomas Troward. Now, Thomas Troward was Episcopalian. He grew up in England, Church of England, Anglican, I guess. We call them Episcopalians here. Over there, they're Anglicans. And Troward was a civil service judge in service to England, and he was sent to India for 20 years, and there he served as a judge. And while in India, he became exposed to the ideas of Eastern philosophy. And rather than saying, oh, that's different, that's not the Christianity that I was raised with, he started to look at it and say, how might these ideas be similar? And he started to see a great similarity. If you step back far enough, as William James said, if you step back far enough and you start to look at these things and say, what might be in common, what might not be in common, he started to see those. And Troward, sometimes you'll see him talked about on the internet as the place where East meets West. So he kind of took the 2 philosophies, Christianity that he grew up with in the West, and then he looked at the Hindu teachings that he was exposed to in India, and he said, you know, they're really trying to express the same ideas, the same concepts, in different language, in different costumes, in different colors, based on the culture that they rose up in, you know. But there's a great deal of similarities. So Troward went back to England, and he started to write what he called, or was called in England at the time, higher thought. We would call it new thought. It was called higher thought. And he didn't know what it was. He didn't know that there was anybody else in the world who thought the way he did. And he was in a tea shop one day. He went in for a cup of tea and, I guess, you know, a piece of cake or something. And in England, they would, you know, if there was like a table for 4 and you were seated at it, if more people come in, they would sit more people at the table. And in America, we're used to, if you get the table, it's yours until you leave. So he was sitting there, and a lady came down and sat across from him, and she started to have tea, and she looked at what he was writing, and she said, I'm sorry, I can't help but notice what you're writing. You're a student of higher thought. And Troward said, what's that? And she explained it to him, and and they got together, and he went on to become a lecturer. And one of the books that he wrote is called The Creative Process in the Individual. And what Troward tried to do was to look at the process by which this thing that we call God creates and say, how does that outpicture in us as human beings? So we have this creative presence, we have this will, we have this volition, we have this something that we call God that decides and chooses and says, I will have that, let it be. And then some power acts upon that will and that intention and makes it so. In the beginning, God said, let there be stars and planets and galaxies and so forth, and here they are. And so that's kind of the book of Genesis in a nutshell as far as the creative process. So Troward looked at that and said, well, you know, since we are part of it, what did it have to create us out of other than itself? It created us out of itself, in its image and likeness, is the way that we're taught in religion. So does that apply to us too? Do you and I, and to all human beings, do we have this power of will and volition that we can decide what it is that we wish to experience? When we do. We do. We know that. You can make up your mind. You know that you can make up your mind. You know that you can decide that after we finish service here that you can go out and you can get something to eat, or you can go to a movie. You have will, you have volition. There's no discussion on that, no argument about that. But if the creative process of spirit is one that is initiated through a mental activity, and then something without a name perhaps, or something yet to be named, that eventually we would call the law of mind. In Christianity it would be called the Holy Spirit, the doer of the word. Something acts upon the word and makes it so. And that's what Trower was trying to say in the creative process in the individual. But Trower's writing was a little bit antiquated, perhaps, and a little bit laborious. He was a judge, and he tended to write things in logical arguments. So he had a major premise, and then he had 2 or 3 minor premises, and then he had a conclusion. And much of his work was transcribed from speeches. So the transcribers, as far as punctuation was concerned, it was like they got paid by the semicolon. They just kept putting semicolons in. I've read some paragraphs where the entire paragraph was 1 sentence, because it just kept running on and on and on. So what Dr. Holmes did was he became exposed to Thomas Trower's writings as Holmes was formulating these ideas. And these first 4 chapters, the Introduction to the Science of Mind textbook, is Dr. Holmes restating in his terms what Trower was saying in the creative process in the individual. So what he's trying to get across to us here, what he's trying to bring us to in these 4 chapters is that, excuse me, there is this creative power of the universe. There is this presence. There is this thing that we call God. And the way that it creates is by an act of will or volition that is then acted upon by something that must be part of it itself, because God is all that there is. But yet it acts as a blind force. It acts as a law. And it then brings about, does whatever needs to be done to bring about the actual physical demonstration of that which Spirit wished to experience. Let there be stars in the heavens. Invisible energy comes forward and forms gas clouds, and however the technical process occurs, we have stars, we have planets. The involution, or the beginning, or the cause, was the will, the spirit speaking the word, saying, let it be. Let there be stars and planets. The evolution is the unfoldment, the process that it took over eons and eons, the process that it took in order to unfold, in order to bring into actual experience that which Spirit had decreed. When we come then to ourselves, when we come to human beings, we have to ask, well, why am I here? Where did I come from? And the idea is that we, you and I, we are individualized expressions of that one life. That it has created us out of itself in order to express, to enjoy, and to experience life in some unique way, excuse me, through us and as us. We have the ocean, and we have waves. The waves you can think of as individualized expressions, unique individualized expressions of the ocean. Each wave is different than the other waves. But the wave is simply the ocean expressing itself as a wave. As Osho would say, is the ocean is waving at us through the waves. The divine has created us out of itself to express and experience and enjoy its own life through us and as us. In the mystical teachings of the Kabbalah, the creation myth is kind of different than the creation myth that we have in Genesis. And the idea, I love this idea. It's just kind of, to me, it's a beautiful way of expressing it. And remember, it's a story that is designed to get us to move to a deeper understanding, not to be taken as a literal truth. But God being all that there is and having all that there is and knowing all that there is, God needs nothing. You and I, in our existence, we think in terms of need. We go to work because we need money, et cetera, et cetera. The divine has none of those needs. It lacks nothing. So what would its purpose be, or what would its intention be, other than to give, to express itself? Right? In order to do that, it had to have something to give to. So the first act of creation in this mythology, then, is that the divine created a vessel that was capable of receiving, and that would be the soul. And the souls understood the divine's plan, if you want to call it that, a plan, the desire to give. But the soul was so close to God that it was already filled. So the soul said, well, in order to create this empty vessel, so that God may enjoy giving of itself, we have to empty ourselves out. So the soul tried to empty itself out quickly as it could, but as quickly as it could empty itself out, it was refilled. Excuse me. And they went into a frenzy, and in this frenzy, they cracked. The first act of creation didn't go so well. Got to be a story, right? Because the divine is perfect. So the soul said, well, what can we do? What can we do in order to empty ourselves out and not be filled up so quickly so that the divine can give of itself to us? And they said, we will remove ourselves in time and space. We will leave the garden, and we will remove ourselves in time and space, and we will go and we will have the experience of good, the experience of the knowledge of good, the experience of the knowledge of evil. And spirit can give of itself to us. So the idea then is that the souls voluntarily gave up their knowledge, gave up their experience, gave up their close proximity to the presence of the divine in order that the divine might have something to give to. Again, this is a story. It's not to be taken literally true, but I want you to think about that. I want you to think about that story. Put your life in a whole different context, See, we say to ourselves, well, if God has created us out of itself and God is perfect, whole, and complete, why do we have an experience that is less than perfection, or seems to be less than perfect? Why do we suffer? Why do we have illness? Why are there accidents? All these kind of things. And it is because we are suffering from our self-imposed ignorance. In the Hindu teaching, they say mankind has had ignorance heaped upon them. Who heaped the ignorance upon mankind and why? In our traditional theologies, we might say, well, it's because human beings have separated themselves from God by sin. In Buddhism, we might say, well, the game, we don't know. See, the game was in progress when we got here. We don't know how it started, but we're here. And we do know that everything that we experience is a result of our thoughts. And we suffer because of our erroneous thoughts, beliefs, and emotions. And the way to liberation is to free ourselves of our erroneous thoughts, beliefs, and emotions. So everybody is kind of saying the same thing. Our thoughts are a creative power in our lives. There is something that we don't know exactly what. As I say, we call it the law of mind. But there is something that acts upon our thoughts. You could call it the law of karma, but I want you to be careful. The definitions of karma that you get out there are varied, and I may not be using that word the same way that you understand it. Spirit creates by having a desire or an intention to create. Something acts upon that desire or that intention, and then it brings it about. Spirit desired to express itself in some unique and individualized way. That desire caused the law to create you and I, to create the soul. And since we are created of it, out of it, we are some part of it, the same creative process exists within us. Excuse me. A couple things that we have to... Let me get a drink of water here so I stop coughing into the microphone. I do apologize. All right, let's see if that holds me off here for another 10 minutes or so. So we recognize then that the best that human thought can come up with about this thing called God is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-presence, and unity or oneness. Right? It's not divided against itself. A house divided against itself cannot stand. So it cannot be both good and evil. There cannot be a power of both good and evil. There is just a power. There is just a power. And that power is always affirming itself. And we call that good. But it is neither good nor bad, except the thinking makes it so, as Shakespeare told us. Its desire for us can only be what it would desire for itself, because it knows us as part of itself. So it cannot desire to send us sickness or pain or suffering or punishment or any of those things. Its only desire is to express its life as us and through us. So I want you to think of the dimmer switch on the chandelier that you have in your dining room, you know. Now, my house where I live, less than 7 miles away, is a nuclear power plant. Now, that nuclear power plant can generate more power than this house would ever use, right? And all of that power is available to the chandelier in my dining room. Theoretically. I mean, I've got circuit breakers and so on, but theoretically, I am connected to a power source that is, as far as my chandelier is concerned, is unlimited. Now, I can make that light glow as brightly as it can by pushing the dimmer switch one way, or I can make that light barely glow at all by pushing the dimmer switch another way. It makes absolutely no difference to the nuclear plant. The generating power in a nuclear plant doesn't care, doesn't know. It is a blind force. You and I are connected to the omniscience, the omnipotence, the omnipresence, because it has created us out of itself. Our belief, our acceptance is our dimmer switch. The example that we use sometimes is you go down to the ocean and you have with you a pail, or you have a shot glass, a whiskey glass, and you go down to the ocean. How much water is the ocean willing to give to you? Well, if you put the shot glass in, you'll get a little. If you put the bucket in, you'll get more. But the ocean isn't deciding, I'm only going to give you a little, or I'm going to give you more. What you have accepted by what you have placed into the ocean has limited its ability to give to you, to give through you. Remember I said everything that we experience occurs in consciousness, in our consciousness. It may touch our skin, it may touch our taste buds, it may excite, the light may excite the nerves in our eyes. But all of the interpretation, all of the experience occurs in consciousness. And what we must do as we proceed through the year, as we proceed through these 4 weeks together, we must start to realize that all of life is a matter of consciousness. It is done unto us according to our belief. There is this unlimited power, this unlimited intelligence, this unlimited presence in the universe that has created us out of itself that we might express, experience, and enjoy its life more fully. But it had to leave us alone. We had to empty ourselves of that knowledge and rediscover it slowly so that Spirit would be able to give to us and through us and enjoy itself and its givingness in the process. This is why I think Holmes says that love is the self-givingness of Spirit through the creative process. It is the unity. It is in this giving and receiving that we experience the oneness and the unity. So last week we were talking about this thing itself, omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, the isness, the suchness, the I amness. It just is, right? Now we are kind of getting into, but that includes me, that includes you, that includes us, that includes everyone. And we start to realize then that the secret of life, if there is a secret, is somewhere in consciousness. So what is this thing called consciousness? What are thoughts? What are beliefs? If the only thing that is limiting my experience in life in any way is my ability to accept more, then how do I change that acceptance? How do I create a greater opening within myself? Where do I create the greater opening? Where is the only place that I have to work? Where does everything that I recognize as me occur? And that's within consciousness. That's within consciousness. So next week we're going to go more into what it does, what it does. There is overlap. We keep coming back because, you know, these 4 chapters just overlap. Every week it comes back, it overlaps. I just want to leave you with this opening paragraph that Holmes wrote for this chapter. The science of mind is not a special revelation of any individual. It is rather the culmination of all revelations. We take the good wherever we find it, making it our own in as far as we understand it. The realization that good is universal, and that as much good as any individual is able to incorporate in his life is his to use, is what constitutes the science of mind and spirit. As much good as any individual is able to incorporate into his life is his to use. And the way that we incorporate it is by changing our thinking, changing our life. And so it is.